Ever feel like history class kind of skipped over the good stuff?
Yeah, definitely.
Like you should know more about these big historical figures, but who has time to like read a whole biography?
Yeah.
Today we're going deep on Abraham Lincoln,
Okay.
and we're using this book by Stephen B. Oates called With Malice Toward None.
Sounds good.
You probably think, Honest Abe, top hat, beard, free the slaves.
Right.
But we are going to dig up some really surprising stuff about his journey.
Okay.
Like, how did he go from this self-taught guy in the backwoods to the president during the Civil War?
It's interesting because his image is like super famous, but people don't really talk about how he got there.
Right.
Like one thing that always gets me that he like really didn't like to talk about his past, especially his childhood.
Yeah. Growing up in a log cabin.
Right.
Yeah.
Like he wanted to keep that private.
In the book, there's this part where a reporter named John Locke Scripps is trying to interview him about his early life. And Lincoln basically says back to him, like, why, Scripps, it is a great piece of folly to attempt to make anything out of my early life, the short and simple annals of the poor. That's my life, and that's all you or anyone else can make out of it.
Wow.
So why was he so, like, hush-hush about it?
I think it shows how ambitious he was. He really wanted to be seen as more than just a guy from a poor background.
Like a professional.
Exactly.
An intellectual.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I think that really pushed him his whole life.
To, like, be better.
Yeah.
To achieve more.
Totally.
It's fascinating, though, how much his parents were different from each other.
Oh, yeah. That's another really interesting thing.
His dad, Thomas, was super social, loved telling stories.
Okay.
He was a leader in their community. But the author uses this funny phrase to describe his way of speaking.
Oh, yeah.
He calls it like grocery store dialogue. And then his mom, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was really religious.
Okay.
But kind of sad. And she actually couldn't read or write.
Wow.
So like completely different.
Yeah, you can really see how both of them influenced him.
Like shaped who he became.
Yeah.
But, Lincoln's early life wasn't easy.
No.
At all.
Not at all.
He was poor, had to do a lot of hard labor.
Right.
His mom died when he was only 9.
Oh, wow.
And he even described where he lived in Indiana as this unpoetical wilderness.
I can see how all that would make you want to, like, get out.
And make something of yourself.
Yeah.
But what's amazing is even with all these challenges, he just craved knowledge.
He really did.
He was completely self-taught.
That's incredible.
Read every book he could get his hands on.
Yeah.
Taught himself math.
Wow.
And practiced his writing and speaking like all the time.
It makes you think about what you could do if you put your mind to it.
Totally.
So he eventually gets out of Indiana.
Right.
Heads to New Salem, Illinois.
What was that like for him?
It's where we start to see him try out different things.
Okay.
Like business and local politics. And he doesn't always succeed right away.
Right. Some failures along the way.
But he keeps at it.
Learns from it all.
Yeah.
And in New Salem, he meets this group called the Clary Grove Boys.
Oh, yeah.
What a name.
They were like his biggest fans.
From the beginning.
They helped him get started in politics.
So he's already starting to like build those relationships.
Right, building a base.
Connecting with people.
Yeah.
The book also mentions this woman named Anne Rutledge. What was their deal?
People like to say they were like star-crossed lovers or something.
Yeah.
But she was actually engaged to someone else at the time, so they were definitely close.
Yeah.
I think the romantic stuff is mostly just rumors.
Gotcha.
Then there's Lincoln's time as a captain in the Black Hawk War.
Okay.
There's this really funny story about him getting in trouble because his soldiers got drunk and were causing a ruckus.
Oh, no.
And his punishment was that he had to carry a wooden sword around for 2 whole days.
I could just picture it.
Yeah.
But the war wasn't all laughs.
Right. It definitely had a serious side.
He saw some really awful stuff.
Like what?
There's a part in the book where he talks about seeing the victims who had been scalped.
Oh, wow.
It really messed with him.
I can imagine.
And I think it got him thinking more about violence. And conflict.
Right.
And maybe even like foreshadowed how he'd later feel about slavery.
That makes sense.
After the war, he decides to become a lawyer.
Okay.
Which is interesting because he was so focused on paying off his debts.
Even debts that weren't technically his.
Right.
Which is where he gets that Honest Abe reputation.
Makes sense.
People saw that he was a man of his word.
That he had integrity.
Yeah.
So while he's building his law practice, he's also developing his own political ideology.
Okay.
And a lot of that came from all his reading.
Right.
about history and law.
Yeah.
His views were really grounded in the ideas of the Founding Fathers. And all that eventually leads him to politics in Illinois.
The Whig Party.
Yeah.
He really goes up against the Democrats.
Doesn't he?
Yeah.
And he becomes a really strong political thinker and speaker.
He was all about improving things.
Like what?
Like canals, railroads.
Okay.
He was also a big believer in the American system of government.
That's interesting.
And this is also when we start to see his rivalry with Stephen A. Douglas,
who would become a major political figure.
Yeah, they had some pretty epic debates.
And I love the story about him almost having a duel.
Oh, yeah.
With James Shields.
That one's wild.
Over these satirical letters that were published in a newspaper.
I guess politics back then was pretty intense.
Uh-huh. I guess so.
But it's funny how that whole situation actually brought him closer to his future wife.
Mary Todd.
Yeah.
That's a good place to stop for now.
Okay.
We'll pick up next time with Lincoln's personal life and the crazy political stuff that was happening back then.
Sounds good.
All leading up to him becoming president.
Can't wait.
So before the break, you mentioned that whole duel thing with James Shields.
Right.
That actually brought Lincoln closer to Mary Todd.
It did.
What was their relationship like?
Well, it was complicated.
In what way?
I mean, she came from a pretty well-off family.
Oh, so like the opposite of Lincoln's background.
Exactly. And Mary, she was really smart, had this sharp wit, knew how to work a room.
Yeah.
And she was really ambitious.
About politics.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think Lincoln was both drawn to that.
Yeah.
And also kind of challenged by it.
So they were pretty different.
Yeah. Their personalities definitely clashed sometimes.
Like how?
Well, she had a strong will. And could be pretty emotional.
Right.
And Lincoln was more reserved.
Yeah.
Thoughtful.
Okay.
But even with all that, they really loved each other.
That comes through in the book. I feel like Mary Todd Lincoln gets a bad rap sometimes.
Yeah, you always hear about her being difficult.
Right.
But this book paints a different picture.
Oh, say.
It shows how smart she was and how tough it was to be married to someone in politics.
Especially during that time.
Exactly.
So while all this is happening with Lincoln's personal life,
right,
the political scene in the 1850s is going crazy.
Oh, yeah. It's a total mess.
The Whig Party's falling apart.
Mostly because they can't agree on slavery.
Right.
And that's when the Republican Party comes in.
And changes everything.
Totally changes the game.
And Lincoln fits right in.
He's got this reputation now as a great speaker. And he's against expanding slavery.
Right.
So it's a natural fit.
And then he gives that famous House divided speech.
In 1858.
It's like a turning point for him.
I think so, too.
Why is that?
It's like he's laying out the stakes.
Of the whole slavery debate.
Yeah.
The moral stakes. And the political ones. And it shows how good he is at making these complicated arguments.
Yeah, making them clear.
So people can understand them.
Exactly.
And this is also when his rivalry with Stephen Douglas heats up.
Oh, yeah, their debates were legendary.
Especially the ones in 1858.
7 of them.
Wow.
And they're like these intellectual battles.
About what?
About like the whole idea of America.
Wow.
And everyone's watching.
A whole country.
The book does a great job of describing them.
Like, what were they like?
Super intense.
Okay.
You can feel the drama.
Interesting.
And even though Lincoln lost the election that year.
For Senate.
Right.
Those debates really put him on the map.
Yeah, he's a national figure now.
And people are starting to think maybe he could be president.
Which is crazy because that's just 2 years later.
It is wild how fast things change.
So during all of this, Lincoln's views on slavery are also evolving.
How so?
Well, at first he's more about just containing it.
Like keeping it from spreading.
Right. But as things get worse...
Yeah, the country's basically splitting apart.
His views get stronger.
In what way?
He starts to think that slavery can't exist alongside democracy.
Interesting.
And that's what leads him to emancipation.
To freeing the slaves.
As a way to win the war.
Wow.
And then comes the 1860 election.
Which Lincoln wins.
And that's when the South secedes.
And the Civil War begins.
It's such a pivotal moment in history.
Like everything's riding on Lincoln now.
The whole fate of the country.
Yeah, what's he going to do?
How's he going to handle this?
We'll have to find out after the break. We left off with Lincoln winning the election and the country like falling apart.
Yeah, it's a crazy time.
So what does the book say about how he handled the whole Civil War thing?
Well, it goes deeper than just, the great emancipator.
Right.
It shows how hard it was to be in charge during that time.
To be the president.
Yeah. And at first he was really focused on just saving the Union.
Keeping the country together.
Even if it meant, not dealing with slavery right away.
So it was more important to him to stop the country from splitting up.
Yeah. That was his top priority.
Even if it meant putting off freeing the slaves.
Yeah, but as the war went on and more people were dying, his views on slavery started to change.
He started to see that maybe freeing the slaves was the only way to win the war?
It wasn't just about morals anymore.
Right, it was about strategy.
Exactly.
So then he issues the Emancipation Proclamation.
And the book really takes you inside what led up to that moment.
Like what was going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, all the political stuff.
And how Lincoln was feeling.
Because he was dealing with people in his own party who disagreed with him.
Right. And he had to think about the border states.
The ones that hadn't seceded.
Right.
This was a really risky move.
But it changed everything.
It changed the whole war.
And it set the stage for ending slavery.
For good.
So he's dealing with all this political stuff. But he also has to figure out the military side of things.
Right. He needs to find generals who can win battles.
Which wasn't easy.
No, he had some bad picks at first.
Like the guy who lost at the first Battle of Bull Run.
Right. That was a tough loss.
But Lincoln kept learning.
From his mistakes.
Yeah.
And he finally found the right guys.
Ulysses S. Grant.
And William T. Sherman.
Who were both determined to win the war.
No matter what.
And the book does a great job of describing all those battles.
It's intense.
From the ones in the East
to
the ones in the West.
It really shows the cost of the war.
Yeah, how many people died.
Soldiers and civilians.
And on top of all that, Lincoln still has to deal with politics back home.
Right, because not everyone supports him.
Like, some people think he's too harsh on the South.
And others think he's not doing enough.
So he's trying to keep everyone happy.
While also trying to win a war.
That's a lot to handle.
Yeah, he was under a lot of pressure.
But as the war starts winding down...
Lincoln's already thinking about what comes next.
Like how to put the country back together.
And what to do with all the freed slaves.
And then he gives that amazing second inaugural address.
Just a few weeks before he's killed.
It's like this beautiful speech about forgiveness and unity.
And his vision for a better America.
Which is so sad, because he never got to see it happen.
Yeah, his assassination was a huge loss for the country.
And the book ends with this really moving description of his death and what he left behind.
It makes you appreciate everything he did.
To save the Union and to fight for what was right.
So what's the big takeaway here?
What should people remember about Lincoln?
I think it's that he never gave up.
Even when things were really bad.
He kept fighting for what he believed in.
And he grew as a person.
Learned from his mistakes.
And ultimately helped to create a better country.
That's a pretty inspiring legacy.
It is.
So if you want to learn more about this amazing guy...
definitely check out this book.
With Malice Toward None by Stephen B. Oates.
It's a deep dive into Lincoln's life.
All the ups and downs.
And everything in between.
You can find a link to buy the book in the show notes.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel.
And tell your friends about the show.
We'll be back next time with another deep dive into history.
See you then.